in front of the Hall of Missions. And please kindly silence your cell phones. And that is the end of this afternoon's announcements. John Q. Barrett teaches law at St. John's University. He's the editor of That Man, an insider's portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Justice Jackson's previously unknown memoir of FDR and the New Deal, and is the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. Professor Barrett is currently working on a biography of Justice Jackson, which will provide the first insider's account of his year away from the Supreme Court, serving as chief American prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Additionally, Mr. Barrett writes periodically to a Jackson email list, which reaches tens of thousands of subscribers and readers around the world, including many Chautauquans. Let me tell you, if you are not on that list, you should be. So email me and I'll get your name to him. It is a wonderful set of stories about Justice Jackson and his life. Professor Barrett will be talking today about Chautauqua's influence on Justice Jackson and Justice Jackson's influence on Chautauqua. Ladies and gentlemen, lawyers and gentle people, please join me in welcoming John Q. Barrett.
Thank you so much, Shara and friends. It seems like I was just with you last week, and it is wonderful to be back. I'm staying in the Wensley Guest House, a great privilege and a wonderful setting, and the registers in each room give you a list of who previously has occupied your bed. So I paged through and discovered to my pleasure that 3 previous occupants of the room were Robert H. Jackson friends and colleagues, albeit 2 younger, but people who knew him well and thought well of him, and he thought well of them. One was Alger Hiss, which I thought was interesting. The other 2, the younger 2, were Arthur Schlesinger and John Kenneth Galbraith, both of whom lived long, incredibly productive lives and became mentors and friends of mine. Indeed, both are blurbers on the book, That Man, which you can see later. And all of that leaves me with one question. As I snuggled into that standard-sized bed, how the heck did John Kenneth Galbraith ever get a good night's sleep in his towering 6'9" frame in a bed that is much too short for that? Now, that's a little biographical, locational point about the 2 of them that touched me last evening. Biography includes locational information, locational identity, locational ties. I name people and you know things about places and backgrounds that define them. Barack Obama, born in Hawaii, right? I mean, I'm just checking that we're on Earth together. Student at Occidental College, student at Columbia University, student at Harvard Law School. Justice Elena Kagan of New York City, Princeton, Oxford, Harvard Law School. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Arizona, a ranch, a cowgirl, if I may, Stanford Law School, Arizona, Washington, etc. Robert H. Jackson, born in Pennsylvania, raised in southwestern New York State, Frewsburg, a lawyer in Jamestown for many years, in Buffalo for a few years, after 20 years of private practice, a Washington government official. Robert H. Jackson never attended college, yet late in his life, serving on the U.S. Supreme Court, biographical entries in encyclopedias, indeed even Who's Who, started to report that Robert Jackson was a graduate of Chautauqua Institution and Albany Law School. I'll come back to that at the end. Those are both wrong and at least half deeply right. Now, Robert Jackson today is an enormous figure. We're allowed to be parochial. I'm a biographer, so I'm really engaged with him, and you're Chautauquan, so you're really engaged with him. And if you don't already know that, that's why we're here. I'll be telling you about that. But he is a figure for his accomplishments that is a big national and international footprint. We heard in late June, when the confirmation hearings for then nominee, now Justice Kagan, occurred. Her testimony when a question was posed about a justice who really moves and influences you. Robert Jackson, he interests me, I read him, he's a role model, I'm fascinated by the guy. And we had heard the same thing 5 years earlier from then Judge, now Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. during his confirmation hearing. We've heard and seen the influence of the belatedly discovered Jackson book, That Man, which became campaign fodder and close reading in Kerry and Bush and Obama and McCain. And indeed, although I'll never be able to prove it, I think might have been in the background a little bit of a trigger for the debate moment when Senator McCain turned and referred derisively to Senator Obama as that one. Robert Jackson is a great private lawyer and public lawyer and an achiever at the global level. The United Nations is today preparing to act on a proposal to build on his Nuremberg legacy to create a permanent institution for the study and teaching of Nuremberg, which will be largely devoted to Jackson. The Documentation Center in Nuremberg, a large nationally funded museum on the order of our Holocaust Museum in Washington, is a dedicated facility that studies the work and achievement of Nuremberg and features a lot of Jackson. And pause to think about that. The German government's National Museum in Nuremberg, celebrating the achievement of the Nuremberg trial. The Nuremberg courtroom, in what's still an active courthouse in Bavaria, in Nuremberg, has been under reconstruction for the last year, and on November 21, this year, the 65th anniversary of Justice Jackson's opening statement at the Nuremberg trial, it will be dedicated as a memorial in the courtroom with a museum and visitor center built around it as a bit of an umbrella facility, with speeches by the German foreign minister, and although invitations still need to be accepted, the invited counterparts from the participating nations, meaning the foreign ministers of Russia, of Great Britain, of France, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's part of the Robert Jackson footprint and mark. Now, why do all these people care? Why do they notice? Well, there are a bunch of things going on. One, he was the best, or one of the best writers in the history of the Supreme Court. And he left us a body of written work that sings. His words grab anyone who is in the field of law, starting as a law student, becoming a lawyer, some becoming judges, etc. Second, Jackson had a kind of independence that makes him hard to pigeonhole. We will hear from Adam Liptak on Friday at the 1045 lecture, the New York Times Supreme Court correspondent. I hope you saw his important, extensive article a few Sundays ago, which the issue with Chief Justice Roberts in a sketch on the cover, and then inside a full two-page spread with a timeline of the justices, arraying them from left to right by statistical measures that political scientists use. And to the far right, or as you're looking at it, to the far right were some of today's current justices. And near the crease at the center of the page was Robert Jackson, because he didn't have a grand theory. He was a pragmatic man. He was a case-at-a-time judge. He was a cards face-up writer. You knew where he was coming from and how he was agonizing and how he best thought something should come out, which sometimes made him left and sometimes made him right. Statistical measures are something I'm a bit suspect of, but it adds up in aggregate to somebody who's in the center and thus can be hero material for John Roberts and Elena Kagan. Finally, Robert Jackson gets all of this today and going forward because he is, I dare say, a heck of a story, a personal biographical story. I want to give you that in capsule form and then particularly pull out the Chautauqua piece so you see Chautauqua in him and him in this place, because it is fundamental and at his core. The Jackson story is a short life. It's 62 years, 1892 to 1954. In those days, that was a full and decent run for a man, and typical. FDR died at 63. Many of the contemporaries also didn't make it much past their early 60s. Jackson was born on a family farm below the state line, Spring Creek in Warren County, Pennsylvania. He moved with his family to Frewsburg and went to the small schools there and graduated from the Frewsburg High School, did a 13th year, a postgraduate year at the Jamestown High School, then became a law apprentice, went to the Albany Law School for 1 year, apprenticed for an additional year, and at all of age 21, as soon as he was legally eligible, he took and he passed the New York State Bar. He became a lawyer. He embarked on this legal career. In the next 20 years, a type of general practice, trial work, appellate work, oral work, written work, corporate representation, corporate counseling, municipal corporate counsel work, Jamestown, Buffalo, New York City, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, Tampa, Miami, Los Angeles, made him a member of the American Law Institute, made him the elected president of the American Bar Association House of Delegates, made him financially quite comfortable. In his wealth in the late 1920s, however, he was the kind of guy who took a pro bono first-degree murder capital case and tried it and won an acquittal here in Mayville. So it was a kind of general practice greatness. But by the 30s, he went on a different type of path. He left the private sector and went into the public sector because as a young man, 1911, with his mentor for whom he was an apprentice, on a trip to Albany, young Robert Jackson at age 18 was introduced to New York State Senator Frank Roosevelt, who was all of 28. And that acquaintance ripened into a political friendship and then a personal friendship and then a supportive working relationship when that Frank became Franklin, and that state senator, after various developments and deep challenges as polio struck him and he came back to state politics, became a governor and a front runner and then a presidential candidate and then a president-elect. And Robert Jackson is part of that rise. Robert Jackson is invited to the New Deal right at the start, but actually is very happy here with his life, with his house, with his horses, with his boat, with his lake, with his Chautauqua institution. He plays a little hard to get. It's not till the first year is completed that he is offered a job that entices him to do what he thinks will be a brief interlude in Washington, D.C. He doesn't sell his house. He doesn't do the packing up. It's a brief plan in the spring of 1934. The job is to be the head of the biggest law office on earth. It's a bit anomalous now, but as I've dug into it, it's been interesting to discover that the general counsel of the Bureau of Revenue in the Department of Treasury, today it's the IRS General Counsel, heading a staff of 200 lawyers, was bigger than every law firm in America, was bigger than the Department of Justice in Washington or any other part of the government. Thus, that makes Jackson the boss of those 200 lawyers, the biggest law firm on earth. The rest of the world had not even embarked on the foolishness of big law firms, but I digress. Jackson took that job, and as the soup to nuts general practicing lawyer that he was, quickly found the administrative work drove him bananas. Luckily, he had a strong deputy, and he completely handed that off. And what he took on was a series of very high-profile litigation and legislative matters for the Treasury Department in 1934 and 1935. He, in Pittsburgh, in the winter, spring, into early summer of 1935, prosecuted America's biggest tax cheat in history, or, if one had a different perspective, the victim of the most unjustified, egregious persecution the government has ever brought, Andrew W. Mellon, the former Secretary of Treasury, the former ambassador to the Court of St. James's, our ambassador to Great Britain, a leading industrialist, philanthropist, financial leader, of course, Andrew W. Mellon, in Pittsburgh. And Jackson wins that trial. It's, every year or decade has a trial of the century. This is a civil tax case, but this is the trial of the century. Mellon's lawyer, who Jackson more than bests, is Frank W. Hogan of Hogan and Hartson, the president of the American Bar Association, Mr. American legal profession. He's famous for saying there is nothing better in a client than a wealthy man who's scared. And he had that in Andrew W. Mellon. The ultimate resolution of that case is something we all benefit from, at least when we're able to visit. On the Mall in Washington, D.C. is the National Gallery of Art. It includes the paintings donated by the Mellon family, by Mr. Mellon, and then by his heirs. Some years after this proceeding had been resolved, and as part of resolving it finally, and it was referred to privately by Franklin Roosevelt as Bob's Museum. Now, Jackson's story then rises up through the government, and I'll just give you the rocket sled version. From the Treasury Department in 34 and 35, he moves to the SEC in 36 on a special assignment. It's big-time litigation defending a big-time securities law that was at the heart of the New Deal, the Public Utilities Holding Company Act. And Jackson litigates that trial court, appellate court, Supreme Court, and wins its constitutionality. The counterpart that would make sense just for us to grasp it today is if the president grabbed some lawyer and said, the new health care law is yours. Defend that baby to the end and win its constitutionality. That's what Jackson did for the securities law. Then he goes over to Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice. He heads the tax division, then he heads the antitrust division. Then for 2 years, he is the Solicitor General of the United States, arguing over 40 cases and winning 90% of them, admittedly to a Supreme Court that had changed and was much more receptive. He then becomes the Attorney General of the United States in 1940, and he becomes a U.S. Supreme Court Justice 18 months later in the summer of 1941. Now that's the rocket sled, and there's an additional piece, which I've already referred to. In the spring of 1945, he is the one lawyer on earth who comes to mind, who is recruited by the President of the United States to go to Europe to prosecute the surviving Nazi war criminals. And you know the general outline, 24 leading Nazis, Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, etc., were the defendants at Nuremberg. That's how it played out later. At the time, Jackson is recruited by Truman to leave the court, an unorthodox and, by our standards, improper kind of extrajudicial service. We were in April of 1945, and the defendant that it was contemplated that Jackson would prosecute in that proceeding, and maybe a couple of others, was Adolf Hitler. Now, of course, he didn't show up, and neither did some of the others in the immediate circle, but that's the stature and the significance of the assignment that Jackson takes on. In all of that life and that story, there are roots, there is content, there is identity, and there is place. And of course, the particular place I want to focus on is this one, Chautauqua. Of course, I mean in a bigger sense, Chautauqua County and Jamestown and the region, but in a particular sense, I mean the Chautauqua institution. Robert Jackson was of this place, and this place was of and with and in many senses by Robert Jackson. And that's something that continues, I think, through this day and going forward. He was here many times on the grounds. He spoke here many times. He also just hung out here and listened and visited and chatted and absorbed and enjoyed many times. A lot of it is off the books. You know, there's not somebody, well, maybe the gate pass thing now tracks all of us. I don't quite know how that works, but there's not somebody logging everyone the way the guest book shows you Galbraith slept here for everybody who is a Chautauquan every afternoon when one drops by. But there is a paper trail that establishes a lot of what Jackson was here. I want to give you, with apologies to Lisa Blatt, who I understand did this yesterday, and to David Letterman, and maybe we all owe apologies to J. Edgar Hoover, I want to give you a 10 list of items and moments and things regarding Robert Jackson and Chautauqua and Robert Jackson. The first one is about the formative nature of this region and this place, particularly in him. The year 1896 is a particular that comes to mind. He was only 4 years old, so he wasn't processing Chautauqua, and he was living on a farm in a beautiful, deeply rural wilderness valley in Warren County, Pennsylvania. But his grandmother, a flinty descendant of British immigrants named Mary Eldred Jackson, was a regular attendee at Chautauqua. She made a point in 1896 of coming here on her own. This wasn't, with her husband or, no, I'm going to Chautauqua. Why? Because there was somebody she wanted to hear. Because it was content, because it was political affinity, because it was knowledge, because it was learning. And that was generally a part of the family environment. It was a Chautauqua-ish family, not in a wealthy sense and not in a resident sense and not in a religious sense, but in a learning substance value sense that raised Jackson. Mary Eldred Jackson, his paternal grandmother, was a descendant of the former treasurer of the Middle Temple in London. So you kind of have an interesting law thread that's part of the Jackson heritage. She comes here in 1896 to hear a presidential candidate. Moment 2, jumping to 1907. I'm not giving you the name because now I will, because he's back in July of 1907. It's William Jennings Bryan. It's the great commoner. It's the longtime leader of the Democratic Party, already an unsuccessful candidate, preparing to run and lose again. And he comes here in the summer of 1907 to Jamestown by train, and then to Lakewood by, I think, carriage, and then by ferry, where he's met by Arthur Bester of the Chautauqua Institution and a lawyer named Frank Mott, who happens to be the apprentice training senior lawyer, with a young, not even graduate of the Frewsburg High School, not even yet an apprentice, but a bit of an acolyte, who's a distant relative by marriage, young Robert H. Jackson. He's 15 years old. And Bob Jackson gets on that ferry, gets in that crowd, gets to be part of that day. They cross the lake, they stop at Driftwood, where Frank Mott has a house, and they have lunch, and then they come up here and they disembark, and Bryan speaks in the amphitheater. And Robert Jackson, luckily living in an age of pen on paper, left in numerous places accounts of that as a galvanizing moment. Chautauqua Institution gave him that. The jump from Frewsburg to the world stage, from a high school class of 5 to a presidential nominee, a future Secretary of State, a great orator, a man of ideas and leadership and stature, is an enormous leap. We know of its imprint because he wrote it, and we know of its imprint because he mimicked it. It's within weeks that Robert Jackson starts to be a litigator in a 15-year-old sense, a litigator in a writing letters to the editor sense. He goes back to Frewsburg and leads the charge in the newspapers against the Board of Education, which is proposing to downgrade the Frewsburg curriculum. It's expensive to start hiring teachers who are college graduates and to begin to offer Regents courses. And the cost-saving initiative was proposing to downgrade it back to the general school model. And Jackson starts writing these letters to the editor and quoting Bryan and all kinds of other somewhat flowery and 15-year-old overwrought prose that is clearly a mimicking of what he was starting to absorb from this place and people like Bryan. He also got it from James Parker Hall, publisher of a Jamestown newspaper, the Hall family that founded the University of Chicago, the Hall family of Jamestown and Chautauqua. He sat in the audience and listened to Professor Hall and his brother many times here, and they became role models and inspiration. We see 10 years later, a third point in time, 1917, the boy, now man, 25-year-old young lawyer Robert Jackson, get to this side of the podium in a Chautauqua context. He spoke as the honored lead lecturer in the Chautauqua Church as a guest of Chautauqua Institution in its winter memorial commemorative on the occasion of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. Now wrap your mind around that. February 1917. I love the summer season here. And I've snowshoed here in the winter season. But I don't know about a lecture in the winter season, even in the confines of a church. But Jackson, a Democrat, came to speak about Lincoln on Lincoln's birthday in the depths of that winter as Chautauqua's guest. And the flowery letters of thanks demonstrate that he performed up to what we come to understand as Jacksonian standards. A fourth moment, building on that handshake, which was an early introduction, was later that year, the summer of 1917, much better weather, when the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, serving in the Wilson administration, comes to Chautauqua, and now the honoring party is a small group. Those 4 names are the president of Chautauqua Institution, and Frank Mott, the leading Democrat of the county, and Jackson, and another Chautauqua official who host Roosevelt here on that occasion. And this becomes a bit of a theme as that relationship deepens. Let me jump as a 5th moment to 1936. You know this one, at least generally, perhaps well. In the summer of 1936, Franklin Roosevelt is completing his first term and preparing to seek re-election. He's just been nominated. He had made a promise to his acquaintance and friend Arthur Bester, now the president of Chautauqua Institution, that during his term in the White House, he, Roosevelt, would come to Chautauqua. Well, now almost 4 full years have passed. And in 1936, Chautauqua was not flourishing financially. It was staying afloat, but barely. So the gate matters always, but the gate then really mattered, life and death. And there's correspondence from Bester to the White House, which you see getting routed around. Eventually, some of it reaches Roosevelt. Please, I beg you, can you come? Will you come? There are independent paths that Bester's taking. There's correspondence to Eleanor Roosevelt, who independently had been here and was a Bester acquaintance. Can you get the president to put Chautauqua on his plan before the year is out, before the summer is out? But the action seems to come through the third channel of correspondence, which is Bester to the Justice Department to Jackson. Jackson at that point is an assistant attorney general, but through the Public Utility Holding Company Act and the Mellon case and other things has really risen to be in the Roosevelt inner circle. And with Jackson's assistance and direct communication speaking with the president, a trip gets scheduled. It gets tacked on to Roosevelt on a train trip surveying flood damage across the state of Pennsylvania, which had suffered grievous damage that summer. And he adds a side trip up here, and on August 14th, Roosevelt delivers the famous "I hate war" speech. Now, we know what comes: re-election, a second term, re-election, a third term, World War. We think "I hate war" is an isolationist statement that pertains to World War II, and it does in a far distant view, but not really, not in 1936. "I hate war," which begins to be drafted in the White House as soon as Roosevelt says yes in July of 1936, is about what's happening in July of 1936. And what's happening is that the so-called nationalist armed forces have embarked on a coup to overthrow the Republican government in Spain. And there is deep concern that this early Spanish Civil War, which is a topic of much discussion and powerful political views, particularly on the American Democratic Party side, to support Spanish Republicans against General Franco and the coup, would lead to a military commitment. Franklin Roosevelt, in a country that was deeply isolationist, domestic, enjoying its oceans, perhaps beginning really to recover from the Great Depression, wanted to get out the message that we were not going to slide down that path to war. And so he comes to the amphitheater and delivers at that podium the message, "I hate war." I had the privilege to teach in Spain this summer, to teach Jackson and Nuremberg to an international audience of students, demonstrating the interest in Jackson. And as part of my reading up, I read some Spanish Civil War literature. One goes to Barcelona and you read Orwell and some other things, right? I was delighted to find a very familiar word in the histories, the big, synthetic, masterful histories of the Spanish Civil War. That word is Chautauqua, as in, the world let Spain go down the tubes. Franklin Roosevelt went to Chautauqua and said, "I hate war, good luck to you," which is an interesting alternative perspective on something we know here. Now, what's the Jackson thread? Well, he got him to make the commitment. He's involved in the speech drafting. The speech drafts show up in Jackson files. He meets the Roosevelt train and the side trip from Pennsylvania. He's here with Roosevelt because Roosevelt is really starting to feature Jackson in 36. He's grooming him to be a judge on the New York Court of Appeals and or the governor of New York and or a national candidate. And so Jackson is at his side. You'll see in that man the photographs of the trio, Roosevelt, Arthur Bester, Robert Jackson. And you see in the film of "I Hate War," in the amphitheater, kind of grainy, but one can make it out, and it's been nicely synced with the sound, Roosevelt at the podium, and Jackson seated on the aisle just behind him. And when Roosevelt gets to the punchline, of course, he punches it beautifully. And Jackson, silently, is mouthing along with him, "I hate war," which only an inside speechwriter, collaborator, buddy could do. That's Jackson at Chautauqua. And Roosevelt coming meant, of course, that the politically neutral and savvy Chautauqua institution was able to build a series of 4 candidates coming here. Not only Roosevelt, but Governor Alf Landon, the Republican nominee, and Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party, and the Temperance Party candidates all came here that summer. And I dare say the Gate overall kept the place afloat, and we're grateful. Moment number 6, the next year. Still struggling, finances, etc. Bester Jackson, correspondence, etc. If you heard my introduction last week to Jeff Schessel, I apologize for repeating, but Arthur Bester puts the arm on Jackson, how can you help this summer? And Jackson delivers in that summer of 1937, the court-packing summer, his close friend, Department of Justice colleague, the Solicitor General of the United States, Stanley Reed. They come, Stanley and Winifred Reed stay in the Athenaeum. The men have dinner the night before at the country club across the road where they could drink Kentucky bourbon. And Reed speaks on a Friday night as the Solicitor General of the United States in a very full amphitheater, which helped the Gate and, of course, put some of the most relevant people in the national controversy of that moment, court packing, here in Chautauqua. Both were names who were likely to be appointees if Roosevelt had won that court packing battle. He didn't, and in the end, they both still became Supreme Court justices anyway, Reed and Jackson. The late 1930s continued this thread of connections. A 7th moment and place is Chautauquan, but not Chautauqua. Because Arthur Bester, in the rest of the year, and President Tom Becker can certainly relate to this, worked Chautauqua 12 months, had New York City involvement and work and fundraising, etc. And in Bester's case, had a position as the head, first a board member, and then the head of the Town Hall of the Air, a speaking series at Town Hall in Times Square, just off 6th Avenue, that brought together for debate the leading figures in national life, radio broadcasts nationally, etc. Well, Bester and his friend Jackson are close collaborators in a lot of that town hall activity, and Jackson is a talent scout and a feeder for many of that, and twice Jackson is a big-time participant in town hall events. One is in the winter, early January of 1938, when Jackson debates a lawyer slash businessman, head of a public utility holding company. Wendell Willkie was his name. They have a debate that is incredibly articulate on both sides. And Jackson is swimming against a very strong current as he's defending the New Deal, securities regulation, etc. It turned out that Willkie very cleverly had requested tickets, gotten his equal share, then said he lost them, got replacements, said he lost them, got replacements, and before you knew it, unbeknownst to Jackson, this hall was packed with Willkie's supporters. So Jackson's presentation is great, and the hooting and hollering he has to deal with is quite amazing as one listens to that debate. That debate is a national presidential race preview, because in 1938 there's starting to be talk that the Republicans might nominate this guy Willkie to run against, of course, the Democrats' likely nominee, Assistant Attorney General, becomes Solicitor General, Roosevelt's underling and likely successor after 2 terms, Robert H. Jackson. In 1940, Jackson, as the Attorney General, is really a serious presidential candidate. You'll see an erroneous thing I wrote about that in the foreword of that man. It's taken me years to really understand this, because we work from the back end. That's where we live. We live in history, and we know how 1940 played out. And we know that Roosevelt sought the 3rd term, played coy, but went to the convention, was drafted, and won, breaking the tradition of retiring after 2 terms. On the front end, I think he really sincerely planned to retire. He started to build the library. He moved half his stuff home to Hyde Park. And as 1940 is dawning, Jackson, as the Attorney General, embarks on a nationwide, high-profile speaking tour. He speaks in those 5 months dozens of times, each nationally radio broadcast, each reprinted in vital speeches. He's on the covers of magazines, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a group that's organized in the next generation New Deal with Roosevelt's support that's planning on Jackson being the guy. This is Tom Corcoran, this is Ben Cohen, this is Bill Douglas, this is Morris Ernst, and this is Franklin Roosevelt telling many people that he thinks, except for his height, which concerned Roosevelt, it was only 5'9", Jackson was presidential stuff. Jackson I'm sure enjoyed hearing that publicly and privately. And, you know, we all kind of think about how we'd look in a Red Sox cap or whatever. You know, it'd be great to play center field in any major league ballpark. It'd be great to become president of the United States. I'm sure Jackson breathed those vapors and felt that way. But he, in his speaking, is being featured prominently and saying a very direct, controversial message. We need this president. I advocate a third term. Now, maybe that's just a jujitsu move that was very clever. But he was really making an argument to Franklin Roosevelt. And it turned out that in the end, he had a collaborator who changed the situation in Adolf Hitler. Because when Germany goes into the Low Countries and then into France, and when France then falls, and when the Blitz begins against Great Britain, of course, it's a different landscape. And Roosevelt's third-term decision by the spring 1940 and officially by the summer of 1940 is shaped by that situation. While that change is happening, Jackson goes on a town hall of the air, begged by Arthur Bester to include town hall in this, this agenda, this schedule, this concert tour that Jackson's embarking on. And he debates the chairman of the National Republican Party. He's the Attorney General of the United States. The Republicans are advocating budget cuts, less public spending, tax reductions, isolationism, controls on immigration, and they hate the President of the United States. They did not have a cosmically weird theory about where he was born. But other than that, there are familiar things in this perspective. And again, thanks to the beauty of recording, Robert Jackson mops the floor with this guy. I won't even belabor this with quotes, except one. Against the charge, says Jackson, that too much taxation from the American people is going to the creation of bureaucracy that is contributing to the education as more and more children are pulled into schooling, I refuse to apologize. For if this country cannot afford to be a country which educates and trains its young, it will cease to be the United States of America that has made us all participants in the conversation we're having tonight. His words. Town Hall of the Air, Arthur Bester production, Chautauqua on the road, in a sense. Moment number 8. I'm now jumping across Nuremberg. The 4th of July, 1947. Jackson he took the Nuremberg job in April of 45. He goes to London in June of 45. He goes to Nuremberg in September of 45. He's away from the Supreme Court for the whole 45-46 year. He does very little traveling because he's got a sort of a public relations problem and a backlog problem and a lot of things that recommit him to the Supreme Court. But he agrees to do a major public speech the next summer. He agrees to the request from Arthur Bester. He agrees to do it here. And by the summer of 1947, there's a Cold War on. It really had started in the courtroom or maybe in the negotiations at Nuremberg and London leading to Nuremberg. Our great ally, the ally that paid the biggest price in lives and won the World War, at least in Europe. The Soviet Union is now the feared aggressor who are preparing to fight in World War III. During the Nuremberg year, defeated out of office former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, of course, went to Fulton, Missouri, and described an iron curtain descending across Europe. That is March 1946, as Jackson's working with our allies, the Soviet Union, in the courtroom at Nuremberg. And Jackson and the British heard a lot about this from their Soviet counterparts. You know, thanks a lot. You know, look what we've done for you, look what, you know, et cetera. Jackson comes to Chautauqua and in the amphitheater to an enormous overflow crowd and radio broadcast nationwide and front page New York Times, et cetera, coverage, delivers a speech with 2 parts. One part is an explanation of Nuremberg, which can't be taught enough. The reestablishment of a commitment to law, the decision to abide by due process, the decision not to line up our captured and defeated enemies and do brutal firing squad methods, the building of an evidentiary record, the discovery and the demonstration for history of the Holocaust is what they did at Nuremberg. And they held individuals accountable. They didn't convict, impoverish, imprison, destroy a country. Of course, there's lots of culpability at many levels, but it goes to the top of the pyramid, and that's where Nuremberg operated. And in a sense, as Germans will tell you today, it gave us our future. Jackson explains that here powerfully and eloquently in the summer of 1947, and then says, against the grain of the time, that World War III is not about to start, that the Soviets are not aliens, that attacking forces are not about to land on our shores, that there's the prospect of a weak America becoming vulnerable, and national defense is important, strength and security is important, but that there are unitary, universal human values that wrap the globe, that include the Soviet Union, and he knew it because he had worked for a year in proximity, merging legal systems, working through evidence, reining in emotional excesses with those commies. It's a heartening message. It's maybe, perhaps, in 1947, a message that turns out to be too optimistic, and Jackson, like many others, gets a bleaker perspective as the 40s conclude in 1950-51, in the depths of the Cold War period. But that's a Chautauqua moment and a Chautauqua, I dare say, values message that he delivered here in 1947. Moment number 9 is really a grouping of everything that I can't much document. All the visits that were part of all these years, the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, of Robert Jackson coming back to Chautauqua. He'd come back to Chautauqua, Jamestown, Frewsburg, Chautauqua County, but also Chautauqua Institution because he had an elderly widowed mother until 1941. He had a beloved younger sister who lived in Frewsburg, and her son, his only nephew, was a beloved charge of sorts who Jackson paid a lot of attention to. And he had fishing buddies. And from here they would embark on this body of water and north up to the Canadian side of Lake Ontario on fishing trips. And he would pass through all of his special places, including this one. He didn't own property. I think he was a house guest, a moocher, but I think a pretty low impact one. He'd stay here with President Bester. He'd stay here with Ernest Cawcroft. He'd stay here with many others who were board members and lifetime Chautauquans as he came here, and he kept a low profile. He was a guy with dungarees, a guy with his riding sweater, a guy with, a dapper bow tie and a bowler. It was the 1930s, 40s, into the 50s. But he was just another Supreme Court justice on the grounds of Chautauqua because it mattered so much to him to be on the grounds of Chautauqua. And Chautauquans are good about understanding that you're allowed to be just another Supreme Court justice. In the last summer of Jackson's life, after he's had a very serious heart attack and barely survived it in the spring of 1954, he again makes that circuit, but adds a couple of stops. He goes to the valley in Spring Creek, to the farm where he was born, which has been abandoned and is overgrown, to picnic. He wants to sit on that soil. He knows his days are short. He visits his old homes in Jamestown and Ellicott. He visits his old office space. He visits old friends, some who he'd gone to school with, grown up with, practiced law with. He goes to courtrooms and courthouses, Warren, Mayville, and he comes to Chautauqua Institution. We have a postcard that history has that he wrote his law clerk, Barrett, who spoke yesterday, from Chautauqua. He said, I just want you to see one of the buildings at this place that is so special to me. It was Norton, the Norton Hall. Moment 10, again, a kind of omnibus category. This is the imprint of all of this. You see it in the behavior. You see it in him helping and him gaining from what Chautauqua offered him, from youth to maturity. But the imprint, I think, is also there in his work as a lawyer and a judge. His closest colleague on the court was Felix Frankfurter. Justice Frankfurter previously had been Professor Frankfurter of the Harvard Law School, the leading academic commentator on the Supreme Court. The quip is that Felix Frankfurter invented the Supreme Court so he could then get appointed to it. And he had a very educated, cerebral, theoretical approach to his job of judging. His restraint in that role fit with Jackson's restraint in that role, but Jackson, no college, 1 year at Albany Law School, apprentice, Western New York, etc., wasn't from that highfalutin world, except they all thought he was great, and he did travel in it. But Jackson had what Frankfurter referred to as Jamestown jurisprudence. And more beautifully, Jackson had a behavior of mentioning Chautauqua institutions, leading Justice Frankfurter once to refer to the court's conference with a word I was delighted to find. The court's conference is the meeting of only the justices. After petitions are filed, they decide whether to hear a case in their conference. And after a case has been argued, they meet in their conference and decide how to resolve the case, the votes, the assignment of the opinion, the substance of the arguments. The court's conference is a gathering of 9 very special minds, having a very candid, full discussion of a very wide menu of topics. And Justice Frankfurter pens this to his dear friend Bob Jackson. I have a speech on Tuesday. I won't be back till Friday night. I'll see you on Saturday in our Chautauqua. And what Jackson has taught Frankfurter is that that kind of gathering, doing that kind of meaty work, is a Chautauqua in the general tent sense and in the particular Chautauqua institution sense. Let me conclude by talking about Robert Jackson as a graduate of the Chautauqua institution. This is noticed by friends, including Ernest Cawcroft, a lawyer who practiced with Jackson, a member of the board here, a lifelong friend, and a pen pal. They kept in very close contact. And Cawcroft, at some point, kind of clips this and sends this to Jackson. He says, "Have you seen this?" And Jackson is very amused. And his reply to Cawcroft says, "That will explain to many people the root of their concerns about my judging and lack of qualification." It's a quip about Chautauqua being all he had and being great, but obviously not being something that confers diplomas. Now, Jackson died young, as I said. It was October of 1954 when he passed away. Sudden heart attack, and he died on a Saturday in the first week of the Supreme Court's term. There's a large funeral in the National Cathedral in Washington. And then his body is transported by train to Warren, Pennsylvania, accompanied by the full, because 8 surviving justices were the full, Supreme Court. Today, justices are more of Washington, so the demise of a justice has not raised a travel issue like this, but it was unusual for all 8 to make a trip like this. Chief Justice Vinson had died only a year earlier, and they didn't quite get all 8 to make the trip to Louisa, Kentucky. But all 8 came. They came to Warren. They were driven north to Jamestown. They came to the funeral that was held there in St. Luke's Church, Jackson's Jamestown Church, or to be fair, Jackson's wife's Jamestown Church. It was more her thing than his. And after the funeral, they all went to Frewsburg, where Jackson's remains were buried in the Maple Grove Cemetery, within blocks of his boyhood home, on the banks of the creek that he had fished and splashed in. And then they all, in cars, were driven by lawyers back up to Jamestown to a lunch at the Moonbrook Country Club. Now, locals will know, and distant guests can follow my finger. It's on the far side of the lake, all the way down, almost at Jamestown. And they have a nice, tragic circumstances, but a nice social gathering, and Jackson's old friends and Jackson's Washington colleagues spend a couple of hours telling stories. And then lunch is over, and there's a train waiting. Their return train was going from Corey, so the idea would be to drive them over there. But they insist. Earl Warren, Chief Justice Warren insists. Justice Frankfurter insists. Justice Hugo Black, who had a complicated but by this time very repaired friendship with Robert Jackson, insists. Bill Douglas, who had a very complicated and not repaired relationship with Robert Jackson, insists. We need to see Chautauqua Institution. And so on that sunny October day, delaying their train, but the train will wait, the drivers bring them up the whole far side of the lake and around the top and into the grounds of Chautauqua Institution. It's not the season, and I don't think there was a year-round resident population here of any considerable size. I imagined it quite buttoned up, and the descriptions that are in some thank you letters suggest it was quite buttoned up. So they drove where they wished, and they got out and they walked where they wished. They walked on stage in the amphitheater. I think they walked under this roof in this hall. I know they walked the shoreline. I know they walked up onto the front porch of the Athenaeum Hotel. Because to say goodbye to their friend Bob Jackson, a colleague in all the complexity of service on the Supreme Court, meant touching what was fully him. And for those 8 justices, that meant touching Chautauqua. Now, we are all people of places, some temporary, some permanent, some fleeting, some enduring. I say Thomas Jefferson, you say Monticello. I say Abraham Lincoln, you say. I say Franklin Roosevelt, you say Hyde Park. If I say Robert Jackson, there are many things that belong in the blank, but a high, high candidate is Chautauqua. It made him, and in many ways, he made it. And thus, it is a privilege to share him here, to study him here, to be part of the growing appreciation of him here as exists around the world. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, 2 questions. Sticks in my mind, I read somewhere that had he not been in Nuremberg, he would have been named Chief Justice. Is that correct?
It's a what if. The Chief Justice, Harlan Stone, died in
Right.
April of '46, and Jackson was in Nuremberg. And Franklin Roosevelt certainly intended to make Jackson Chief Justice. He was gone too. Harry Truman had picked Jackson out of everybody on earth to be his guy to prosecute Nazis. Harry Truman thought very highly of Robert Jackson. And it gets complicated, but insider process in Washington persuades Truman to go in a different direction.
And secondly, is it fair to assume that in the movie Judgment at Nuremberg that Spencer Tracy was basically Jackson? I mean, it was that...
No, Judgment at Nuremberg is a wonderful film. It's actually not about the Nuremberg trial. Jackson's Nuremberg case was the first, one and only international trial against the principal individual defendants. Thereafter, the alliance fractured, so there was no further international trial, but the United States, in the sector it controlled in Germany, which included Bavaria, which included Nuremberg, tried 12 subsequent cases, which focused on sectors of Nazi culpability. One sector, prosecuted in one of those subsequent cases by the United States alone, was the justice case, the judges and prosecutors who had perverted law to impose sanctions, take property, imprison political enemies, communists, Jews, etc., of the Nazi state. The justice case is portrayed in the movie, but I had the privilege to talk to Abby Mann, the award-winning screenwriter of that film, and I've studied the script, and of course I've studied Nuremberg. What Abby Mann did in writing that account was use the record of the justice case and a whole lot of language from the international case, including Jackson's opening statement, including Jackson's closing statement, including some of Jackson's cross-examination. So in the mouth of characters in Judgment at Nuremberg, not just the judge, Spencer Tracy, but even more so the prosecutor, Richard Widmark, and other characters in various points, you get part of the Jackson vocabulary words record. You might have noticed in today's New York Times, just a quick digression, the obituary of a wonderful, wonderful man and a great, great American lawyer and judge, Benjamin Kaplan, who died last week at age 99. He was the last surviving member of the lawyers at the international trial. He was part of Jackson's original staff. He, more than anyone else, wrote the Nuremberg indictment as a fairly young Army lawyer and lived a very long life and did such things as invented modern copyright law and the rules of civil procedure, and was a very distinguished Harvard Law School professor and a very distinguished, accomplished judge in the state of Massachusetts. And 99 is an incredible run. Ben Kaplan is quoted in that obituary, and you can see him on YouTube say that one of the things that he, as a young man at Nuremberg, was very concerned about was that this just wasn't going to work. You know, we're doing an international trial, we're merging legal systems, we're dealing with huge amounts of evidence, we're in war-torn rubble, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, and it's the bottom line of the obituary in today's New York Times, What I didn't have was the vision. Jackson had the vision. And some of that is what you hear in Judgment at Nuremberg. Yes, sir.
John, thank you very much for a compelling, brilliant lecture again. I want to make one addition to your places of significance in which Jackson practiced before he went to Washington. That's the little town of Clymer where he practiced and made a case of water rights in a small creek and the electrification of the town his concern. But it ties to Clymer in another way, and that is the hostess at the Wensley House for all of those speakers, with the possible exception of Alger Hiss, was also from Clymer. Her name is Winifred Llewellyn. Many people know her here, I'm sure.
Oh, I remember Winnie very well.
You knew, well, okay, you knew Winnie.
But I didn't know the Clymer piece.
Well, you must know the Clymer piece, or you're not complete in your Jackson history.
Thank you very much.
But I want to ask you a question. It's a question I've asked you by email too, and I think the audience here will appreciate the question. That question is, Jackson died in 1954. He was an employee of the U.S. government at the time, and the question is this: how much of his hospitalization was paid for by the government, and how much did it cost to have Jackson spend 7 weeks in 1954 in a hospital in Washington, D.C.?
The first part is easy, zero. He paid out of pocket, and he had a fair amount of money in his pocket. He gave lots of advice across his life. One piece of advice he gave in a commencement address to young people in 1930, when the Depression really hadn't pushed times into the crater, was take care of yourself financially so that you can do things that are valuable in your life. And Jackson, in a sense, took care of himself financially and loved every minute of it, and then did things that were, as he viewed it, even more valuable. So he had a pretty nice house here in Jamestown. And once he was appointed to the Supreme Court, he went house hunting in Washington. He made an interesting offer on a house in the country in McLean, Virginia, Hickory Hill, 6 acres. He built a paddock for his 3 horses there. But his contract, his offer, which was accepted in the summer of 1941, was contingent on him being confirmed to the Supreme Court. And it's a nicely phrased thing that he wrote in by hand. He says, this is contingent on my confirmation to the position for which I have been appointed, for if not confirmed, I have no use for this property. Meaning he was planning to come back here before he got a life sentence to Washington. His hospitalization I can't quite document in the 7 weeks in 1954, but he had a 7-day hospitalization a year earlier for a thyroid operation. Ironically, while William Rehnquist was his law clerk, Jackson had a serious thyroid issue, and he really thought it was cancer, and he thought it was curtains. And it wasn't, but his heart wasn't good, and curtains came soon enough. Those 7 days cost him out of pocket hospitalization, food, nursing, night nursing, prescriptions, etc., a little over $100. So healthcare inflation is, as you might have already heard in these times, an issue that we should be addressing.
Thanks, John. I learn something new every time I hear you speak. 2 quick questions. World War I, did he serve? And was he present when FDR gave the I Hate War speech here?
World War I, he did not serve. He was the sole support of his mother, then a widow. She remarried and was widowed again. He was the sole support of his wife, who didn't work outside the home, and he was the sole support of his sister, the beloved sister who he became the custodian of when their father died. And on that basis, he applied for an exemption, and it was granted by the draft board. He also, I must say, was a very vocal supporter of Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat. He met Wilson when Jackson lived in Buffalo and practiced law there. And he believed in this kept us out of war stuff that was part of the Wilson re-election message in 1916. Thus, when Wilson pivots and steers this country into the war to end all wars, Jackson has a pacifist streak of objection. He's a very vocal critic of that position, his own president, his own party. Once the United States is in the war, Jackson quiets down about that, but he does not serve. He was never in the military, except by assimilated rank. He was a general at Nuremberg. The president gave him that, which allowed him to requisition and command cooperation from military personnel. As to the I Hate War speech, yes, he was here, and he was involved in getting it to happen. He was involved in writing it. He's seated there. He's at Roosevelt's side before and after, and he's mouthing the words as the president delivers the speech. Yes, sir.
We got here a little bit late, so I apologize if you've answered this in the earlier part of your talk. Both yesterday and today, we heard references to some really nice writing by Mr. Jackson, the opening and closing of his Nuremberg talks. Are these available on the internet? And if so, can you give me a citation or a guess as to where to go?
They're available everywhere on the internet. They're available at the Robert Jackson website, which is roberthjackson.org, in the speeches field. But if you just Google Jackson opening statement Nuremberg, it'll jump up. Same thing with the closing statement, with an extensive argument he made mid-trial about the organizations, which is an underappreciated but deeply eloquent speech, and with his witness examinations.
Thank you very much.
I'll stay with the right wing.
When you were doing all the research on Jackson and FDR and Bester, I found one of the mystery periods for Bester is during that same period in World War I when he left here and went to Washington and served in a fairly senior post. And did you find any of the things in Bester and FDR coming together then?
That's an interesting question. I don't believe I have, but I don't think I've known to look for it. Okay. At Hyde Park at the Roosevelt Library, I've done a lot of research, and the files are arranged by period. So there are Assistant Secretary of the Navy files, archival materials there, and then they're sub-indexed by people and topics and so forth. But I don't think I've ever looked for Arthur Bester in that time period. So I will.
Okay, we can do that.
Yes. Thank you very much. I will be, oh, I'm sorry, please.
Just one more question. During World War II, there were two opinions, one saying that certain religious groups didn't have to, had to salute the flag, and then they reversed themselves in 1 year. Now, some of the writing shows that he was in the Barnett case, which reversed it and said they didn't have to, but how did he stand on that case? Was he on the same side after it was reversed, or what?
Jackson was not on the court when the court decided the Gobitis case, the Pennsylvania case in 1940, upholding the compulsory flag salute.
Right.
He's appointed in 41. He's images. I don't know how that looked in 1940. I think that looks pretty bad. But in 1943, the Supreme Court, with the exception of Justice Frankfurter, who pens an impassioned dissent, agrees that it's a First Amendment issue. In addition to that decision, Jackson, during the war, pens another opinion, not for the court, but a dissenting opinion, in the case of Fred Korematsu. Korematsu was a Japanese American who refused to obey the exclusion order to leave San Francisco. He was caught, he was prosecuted. That was a federal crime. And when that case goes to the Supreme Court, one of the enduring blots in our constitutional law is that the Supreme Court upholds the executive power and the legislative decision to criminalize, on the basis of race and ethnicity, American citizen presence within this country of freedom. The vote is 6-3, and Jackson is one of the three dissenters. Each wrote for himself, but for Jackson as a relatively young justice, and the policy being his president, Franklin Roosevelt, it's a case that I think is quite revealing. That's another part of his wartime service. That gives me a chance to close by saying that Jackson, in the last years of his life, was writing about Franklin Roosevelt. He intended to write a memoir, but he died before he completed it. It's both biographical about Roosevelt and deeply autobiographical about Jackson. It's called That Man, an insider's portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Thanks to the Jackson family, I had the opportunity to find it, edit it, assemble it, augment it, and publish it. And it'll be available, and I'll be happy to talk to you and sign, etc. Thank you very much.
Do a great job. You're called the Woods Crew. Why is that?
Going back to...
Is that a long time tradition?